Well, hello, everybody. I'm Marilyn Hawes with UnprecedentedTV for my show Heart and Soul, and you'll be able to find us on YouTube. I'm also CEO of Freedom from Abuse, and it's a charity seeking to prevent child abuse, and in fact, any abuse now existing in society, of which there's far too much. So for Heart and Soul, I'm inviting anyone with a lived experience or an interesting story to tell, interesting job, and as a guest on my show. Now, if you have a situation that you'd like to discuss with me and come on, and you think, well, she hasn't rung me yet, please do get in touch with either myself directly on the Freedom from Abuse website, and then together we can discuss the issues from which I find all too often people turn away from, and they don't want to actually consider somebody else's reality and ignore situations which I think need to be given oxygen. And I think in that way, we can actually start maybe a different conversation, because people may have had preconceived thoughts about something that now makes them think differently. And as every week, I like to end on hope. So my lovely guest this morning, and I've known her some time, she is the lovely Professor Melanie Lang. She is Professor of Safeguarding and Children's Rights in Sport. Hello, Mel.
Hi, Marilyn. Good morning. Morning, everyone.
Good morning. Lovely to see you. I feel I'm a little bit of a fraud doing this, I think, Mel. I'll tell you why. I'm a great believer in sport. I think it's so good for mental health and everything. But I have to admit, I went to a private school and I didn't like the sports mistress. I think she was questionable in her behaviour. So I used to write my own sick notes because I was very good at forging my mother's signature.
Right.
So I told in my letter that I hated going to hockey, which was like field games, and we always had to have a shower afterwards. And that was the reason why I didn't like sport. And you would understand what I'm trying to say, that I'm not going to say. Yeah. So I thought, no, I'm not up for this. I'm going to write and say, I'm so sorry, Miss Jones. This is from my mother, but Marilyn is having 2 periods a month, and it's very difficult for her to play sport. I got away with it for 3 months, and then she gave me this letter, and I thought, oh no, I've been found out. So I wrote back and said, dear Miss Jones, thank you for being so concerned. Marilyn will now be going to see a doctor.
That's very entrepreneurial of you, really.
I didn't tell my mum until she was very old. Anyway, that's why. And I do think that sort of experience can put people off, can't it? So can we start with how you ever got into this?
Yeah. Oh, yes. That's a story. So I think I just want to say first that I think what you said there in your intro about drawing attention to issues that people often choose to ignore is so important. And I think that the topic we're going to talk about today around safeguarding abuse in sport is exactly one of those topics. It's so important, and so few people either know about it or want to think or talk about it. My own experiences and how I got into this, because it is quite a niche area, is I was myself a youth athlete. So I'm an asthmatic, and quite commonly as an asthmatic, my doctor told my parents that swimming would be good for me. So they took me down to my local pool. I could already swim, but I joined a local swimming club. And it just turned out to be something that I really loved and I really excelled at. So I progressed through the ranks in my swimming club, competing initially just local level, then regional, and then I moved it to national level. I moved to a few different clubs where they were sort of elite training clubs, and I ended up as a child athlete, competing for Team GB in the Youth Olympics. So my life had been sport, essentially. At this point, I'm talking, I was like 14, 15, still obviously in school, but all, frankly, of my time outside of school was spent in doing sport, whether competing or training. And at the time, I was aiming to go to the senior team, there was quite a high profile case of sexual abuse in sport, and it involved the Olympic women's swimming coach. He was a guy called Paul Hickson. He coached at a swimming club down in Swansea, as well as being the women's team. Now, I didn't know at the time, I was a child, didn't know anything about any of this. And so I recall going to a training camp, and Paul Hickson was there. And all us children were excited, he's, he could potentially, that's where we wanted to be. We wanted him to be our coach in the future. And I remember people being, super excited and kind of giggling in corners about how great it was that he was there. So I'm extremely fortunate. Nothing, negative happened to me in that sense in sport, although there were questionable comments and other particularly emotional forms of abuse that occurred in my home training clubs. But years and years later, so I ended up, I never did make it to a senior Olympic team. I got injured, left the sport, carried on with my life. Always continued being interested in sport, but didn't get involved again. And I wasn't working in sport. And years later, I had a friend who had competed on the Olympic women's team, who eventually went public and ended up being part of a group of very brave women who had Paul Hickson convicted.
Well done.
So, yes, this was sort of, mid-90s.
How long did he get?
17 years,
Woo!
Which at the time was the longest sentence for any sexual offender at the time. Okay. So it was through those experiences of what people that I knew when I was swimming, but I didn't realize at the time what they were going through, that I became interested in this whole area of the abuse of particularly I'm interested in the abuse of children in sport, although I absolutely recognize this can happen and does happen to adults as well. So essentially I went and I did a master's degree and then a PhD, and ended up working at Edge Hill University in the Northwest, where my research and some of my teaching focuses on child protection, welfare, not just in sport, but I always make a point of including sport when I talk about safeguarding and child protection issues. So what I do a lot in my job now in terms of my teaching is, I'm working with young people who, they're so inspiring in many ways. They are going to be, the future social workers, educators, those kinds of roles, youth probation workers as well. And very often they don't know about sport as a locus for violence and abuse. It's never come up before. So I always make a point of making clear to them that although sport is and can be a super, super positive experience, for many, many young people, and it certainly has many, many, benefits, health, so physically, behaviourally, educationally, there are loads and loads of benefits of sport. It does also have that darker side, and it's really important that people know that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think really, because, I was music. I actually did do swimming, but that wasn't with the school. And I think the swimming coach I had actually became an Olympic coach. He was lovely. I was a real crush on him. I was only 9. Anyway, I have the same with music as well. And I think sport is the same. And I think drama is the same. That the child has real talent and naturally wants to live the dream. Yeah. So once you are under someone's sort of eye line, that this child I can give extra lessons to. I've seen it in music, drama and sport. I think has got, I spent a whole year, actually, I think I told you some time ago, training the coaches of the Lawn Tennis Association. Yep. And they had a terrible time, didn't they, with Wrexham Tennis Association, Tennis Centre, that's right. And the guy there, he was a senior coach, was he not? He was level 5, Daniel Sanders. And he did classic stuff that should have been an alarm bell. And in fact, I remember one dad, and you can look it up, by the way. You can look up Wrexham Tennis Centre. It'll all be there. You just Google it. And one dad was a child protection officer of the police and said to the welfare officers, if I didn't know better, I'd say this man was a paedophile.
Right.
And no one did anything about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think with sport, and also it's, dare I say this, if I had that sort of interest, I would be attracted to, I think, swimming and gymnastics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, sport as a whole sector, traditionally, it has not had the same levels of safeguards in place as, say, education. It still doesn't completely. I think, again, a lot of people don't realise that. A lot of people don't realise that when they drop little, their son or daughter off at the sports club, that it is possible that that coach will not have undertaken a DBS check, a criminal history check. The kinds of questions that parents might well ask a teacher or look on the website of the school about safeguarding, they often don't think to ask in a sports club. Sports clubs are still sometimes, sadly, treated as creches for children, while parents go and do other things in their very busy lives. So absolutely, parents totally have a responsibility to play here, and part of doing that is about educating them about sport is a sector where these kinds of this kind of behavior, this oppressive and violent abusive behavior, absolutely does occur. I mean, can I give you some stats to give you some, ideas? So again, I think I've been doing this more than 20 years now, and I still come across people who say to me, gosh, I never even thought about sport. Never even occurred to me. So, it's still, even though in theory we have had child protection and safeguarding measures in sport, certain standards in sport for around 20 years now, it's still not very well known about, certainly from parents. So to give you an idea, so I was involved with some colleagues at Edgehill University in a European study of 10,000 people. These were adults. We were asking them for ethical reasons. We were asking about their experiences when they were children in sport. And we actually asked them about their experiences inside sport and outside sport to try to compare. And broadly speaking, the rates of violence and abuse within sport and outside sport are the same. So sport isn't a particular risk to children, but it is just as risky as elsewhere. And the statistics, I think, are quite shocking. So of the 10,000 people involved in that study, 3/4 of them reported at least one experience of violence or abuse in sport before they were 18. So what that means, 3/4, yeah. So what that means is, if you're involved in sport, you are more likely to experience violence and abuse than to not experience it.
I think that's right. And I mean, I think bullying, the psychological stuff of, from some of the coaches is dreadful. And referencing what you said about DBS checks, because this came up when I was doing the Lawn Tennis Association. I don't know. I think it is true of all sport, actually, isn't it? That coaches are freelance, aren't they?
They often, it depends. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're employed by a governing body. Sometimes they're employed by a club, but not so commonly. Often they're volunteers. The DBS reason that, so if they work in what is termed regulated activity with children, then an adult does have to be DBS checked. But where that sort of the gap really in that legislation is that if they are working with another coach, with another adult, so the adult is in regulated activity and is DBS checked, another adult can assist, and they don't have to be DBS checked. And what of course then happens is sometimes, the reality is that coach, maybe even in the same swimming pool or the same gym as the regulated activity DBS check coach, but they are on their own with children and able to develop a rapport with them. that can then be exploited if they wish.
That's right, absolutely right. And it's easy to do, very easy to do. I mean, you've got some other stats that you gave me as well. One on interpersonal violence. And then can you do that one?
Yeah, so this was the same study, the European study of 10,000 people. So we looked at respondents in the UK, Spain, Germany, Romania, Austria and Belgium. And that study found that you mentioned psychological violence, psychological abuse there. That was the most commonly experienced form of abuse by some way. 65% of people who responded experienced psychological or emotional abuse before they were 18 in sport.
Wow.
In the UK, that was 66. So we've got overall stats for all countries combined, and we've got UK stats. So in the UK, the rate was 66%. So
can you explain for listening how you would describe psychological abuse in sport?
It is a wide-ranging category. We asked questions about a wide range of behaviours. It may include things like fat shaming, things like, as you said, bullying, those kinds of behaviours, name calling, excluding, ignoring, alienating, fat shaming, and sort of dangerous weight management techniques, and it's a particular issue within particularly certain sports, particularly when we're talking about children. But I recall in my days, I admit this was many years ago now, but in my days we used to have to keep a diary of both our training log of what we'd done in each training session and a separate diary of what we ate. And what we ate, that eating diary and the training log was submitted to the coach every month for him to look at, comment on. We were weighed regularly on the poolside in our swimming costumes in front of parents or the coaches or the athletes, and our weight was tracked. Weight management techniques like that. I'm not saying that they're widespread, but they certainly still do occur. Athletes are still weighed. There is still a lot of pressure to fit a certain body shape and size. There's an expectation that, the phrase that's often used is slim to win. There's an assumption that the slimmer you are, the less body fat you've got.
Say that to a 12-year-old and you've got them looking online at social media sites to talk about, and before you know it, they're anorexic.
Absolutely. And, again, this isn't quite in my area of expertise, but I know that, there is lots of research that shows that athletes as a whole, not just children, but athletes as a whole, are around 4 times more likely to suffer from disordered eating or eating disorders. And it's part to do with that culture of sport. Yeah.
In fact, schools, Mel, I've known, and when I do train a whole school, I also talk to the chefs and people like that, because a child that's got an eating disorder I don't know if you've come across this, but I have seen it in schools, who's got an eating disorder sometimes, and this includes the boys, will hide their anorexia in a way, or coming into anorexic, by not eating properly the school lunches or their packed lunches, and say, I'm sort of join a sports team, and that covers the fact they're actually not eating properly, and because they're really more keen on being anorexic and have an eating disorder. I have seen that in schools. I don't know if you've come across it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I personally kind of engaged in terms of my research and teaching, but I am aware, because it links to safeguarding, I'm aware of research that shows, that and absolutely boys are affected too. Eating disorder, or I suppose disordered eating, is kind of a spectrum of behaviours. And you have the clinically diagnosed eating disorders at one end, and you have sort of unhealthy, disordered forms of eating at the other. And not all forms of disordered eating morph into a clinically diagnosable condition, but it's certainly, if you are in an environment where so much attention is paid to what you are eating and to your weight, where slimming to winning is valued and is celebrated, surrounded also then by social media and just general a culture that that valorizes slimness, that that can't be good. And this is part of the reason why people involved in sport, particularly at high levels of sport, are more likely to develop clinical eating disorders.
Because also you've got sorry, my light's gone out. What I was there was and you said something I saw come in as well. 44% the physical advantage. I'm horrified that people are physically violent to children in sport. Like, I mean, it's just awful.
Yeah, again, this is a broad spectrum of types of behaviour, everything from hitting, beating, kicking, smacking, right through to certain forms of forced overtraining could constitute physical abuse. So if a child who perhaps isn't physically or mentally yet ready for a particular amount of training, a particular level of training or frequency, but coaches enforce that. Often this can be part of a policy, in order to stay in this squad, you need to train a minimum of 8 times a week, for example. That kind of thing is still quite common in some sports, particularly at the more sort of elite levels or sports that are squads that are aiming to produce elite athletes will often have a quota for how many hours athletes are supposed to train, and that doesn't really take much account of body diversity, of maturity, and so it can constitute physical abuse if a child is forced to train more than they are physically capable of, and they don't have sufficient rest periods as well. Remember, we're talking about children who are also still going to school, right?
And I think that's when you look at my little ones, my little people, they do gymnastics. Now, I am passionate that my daughter stays and watches, because I just think this is, as we're getting into the safeguarding bit, I really do think that people are, parents do need to be there. I think they really need to be there and watch their child. There's too many of them, as you said, alluded to just now, where they drop them off and they go with their busy lives. The child that's going to be approached is going to be most likely the child who's always hanging around that last 5 minutes after the coaching. So, and I mean, when you look at what gymnasts do, and I kind of get quite worried about that as well, because they have little bodies, and are they overstretching? I mean, I just think, are they overworking their limbs and their tendons and things like that? But I would absolutely say to parents now, you have to factor in that child's coaching to your day. You don't drop off, you watch. And I think also when I was training the Lawn Tennis Association, I mean, it is every adult that comes into that club it should be aware of what the children are looking like. I'm coming on to your next bit of your stats now, called the number neglected. Neglected.
Absolutely. So again, the European study found 37% of these adult respondents who were talking about their experiences as children in sport had suffered some form of neglect. Again, we're talking about a wide spectrum of behaviours. It can be, a coach failing to ensure that, the equipment is safe. That would constitute a form of neglect, and that could lead to injury. It could also be, there are different forms of neglect. It could also be things like, when a child has an injury and the coach, and I've seen this as part of my own research, the coach will not let that child stop training. It's a form of medical neglect. So they may adapt the training. I've seen child swimmers, for example, it's certainly not only unique to swimming, but continue to train, just do an entire 2-hour session with a kickboard because they have, say, an arm injury. Potentially that that could be problematic for sure. So again, neglect contains a wide spectrum of different types of behaviour. Around more than a third of people have experienced that as children in sport.
And it's also, again, my experience with the LTA, there was a coach up in the Northeast, and he said to me that when he was a little boy going to a tennis club, he was about 11 years old, and he was responsible for his alcoholic mother. And so he never had any money for the tuck shop. He was always hungry. He never had the right clothes. Those are the sort of things that are very obvious also to comment on, aren't they? I mean, and I said to him, didn't anybody, no one noticed, no one. And I said, I suppose you were the quiet little boy, the people pleaser. You didn't want because you were somewhat embarrassed about your home life. And he said, yeah. Everybody's responsibility to look, isn't it?
It absolutely is. You know, safeguarding, the mantra is safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. Absolutely. It really is. That's everybody who's involved in sport, however tangentially. That certainly, you know, sport, if you think about it, people involved in sport are actually really well placed to identify violence, abuse and neglect that's perhaps happening outside of sport. You know, because they have these close relationships with children. They often develop, you know, certainly I used to look up to my coach. You mentioned this before. So, you know, you do develop really close relationships with the young people that you're working with. And, you know, it may be that you're in a position through, you know, the seeing children while they're getting, while they're training, perhaps in less clothes than they might usually wear. You know, it's an opportunity to maybe notice something that perhaps a teacher might not notice. Equally, a child may disclose to people in sport because they trust them. So, you know, sport it certainly has its own problems with people behaving, you know, abusively within sport, but it also can offer a potential opportunity for adults to recognise signs and symptoms of violence and abuse early in children, and so that they can then report that again and again. It should be a responsibility to report things like that. It should be mandatory.
It should be mandatory, 100%. It should be mandatory. I very much support Mandate now because they do great work. But when I was doing the long tennis stuff, and of course they were, as I say, freelance coaches, their reporting went up by 50% after I'd gone up and down and across the country. Because if people, they don't know what to look for. That's the point. And going on to that bit, can we get on to the stats you found for non-contact forms of sexual violence and also actual content?
Again, I think this these stats often really shock people because in this large scale, it's the biggest scale study done on the prevalence of what we called interpersonal violence and abuse of children in sport to date. Non-contact sexual violence was reported by 35%
of 10,000 people.
And contact forms, and these were separate categories. Contact forms was reported by 20%. So you know, these are very, very high numbers, particularly when we think, you know, our sample was over 10,000 people, and that is scalable. But it you know, we're talking about millions of children. In the UK alone, around 70% of children take part in sport at some level. So we're talking about very, very large numbers of children that are experiencing these behaviours.
So the non-contact forms of sexual violence, is that like groping?
Groping would be a contact form because there would be physical contact. Non-contact would be, you know, we're talking images. Exposure could be online as well, requesting certain behaviours, the filming.
Of course.
Behaviours.
How about child-on-child abuse? Does that come your way a lot?
It's quite interesting because I think for a very long time, and there have been people researching child protection and abuse in sport in the UK for a long, even longer than I've been around. Around 30, 40 years now. And the focus was always on predominantly adult coach on child abuse. Actually, what we're learning now, the more research that is done on this is much more recent data, is that broadly perpetrators come from both peer athletes groups and from coaching or other adults in sport groups. So I think what's probably not surprising is that in the vast majority of cases, the perpetrator, the person perpetrating the violence or abuse is well known to the victim. We know from not from the study that I was involved in, but other research, most perpetrators are male. Again, perhaps not surprising. We do need to remember that doesn't mean that females don't abuse. They absolutely do. All forms of abuse can be perpetrated and are perpetrated by women. But most are male. Most are adults. Well, most are adults in sport. There is slightly different data depending on which study you look at. Most commonly, it's coaches or instructors. But peer athletes, whether that's a child or an adult peer athlete, it is also quite common named as a perpetrator. So there was a study from Australia, found that 69% of perpetrators who were reported were actually peer athletes. Another study found it was around 50%. So it's very, very high numbers.
It is very high. And I do think some of it is also, though, I mean, if you were that way inclined and you see these gymnasts and the positions that they get in and the scanty clothes that they're wearing, which they need, but if you are that way inclined, that is going to be your natural attraction, isn't it? Because you're halfway there anyway. I mean, I with my little granddaughters that do this, I ask their parents to actually buy them the leotards with the, like, it almost looks like they've got little shorts on as well. So that area is not as exposed or defined. You know what I mean? Does that, you know what? You know, there's things like little, they've got little short things on the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's a really difficult one, that, Marilyn, because there isn't a lot of data on this. So there hasn't been much research yet that has looked at sort of specific sports and the risk factors within specific sports. And there is some research, again, a study that I was involved with a colleague from Belgium, who actually found that there was no correlation between sports where there was little clothing worn versus the risk of abuse. That was one study. So, and I'm not aware of others. So there is still, a lot of work to be done, I think, in that area, but it isn't necessarily the case that the clothing that is worn or the body that is exposed really correlates with risk of abuse.
Yeah, that is very interesting. That is very interesting, because I would have actually thought it wasn't that at all, you know, because you think, well, it's only one study. Anyway. Have you seen, though, with because it's definitely true in schools, have you seen with child on child, because, you know, it used to be called peer on peer, didn't it? Now we have to call it child on child, except if you're 16. I mean, you're still you're a child, I don't know. I mean, certainly in schools, the sexual violence of child on child has increased. Now, Andrew Tate, I think, has something to do with that. The amount of pornography they're watching online, I think, has increased that. I don't know if you've seen that increase in sport.
It's very hard to talk about increases because we don't have any baseline figures from previously to compare to, basically. So what we certainly know that there has been an increase in reporting. Cases. That doesn't mean to say that those are all new cases. It may be that they were happening before and people weren't reporting them because they didn't know where, didn't know how, and so that is a slightly different thing. But reporting of abuse versus actual statistics, we're still in the very early days of the number of studies that have looked at the prevalence or the rate of violence and abuse in sport. There's there's really not that much that we can compare to, so we can't say definitively that the numbers are actually increasing, but certainly reporting rates show that numbers are increasing,
and that's positive. That's great, because it takes the onus off the victim and tells them that this is not my fault. You know, you're the creep, not me.
And I think that is such an important point. And you mentioned this, I think it was about the lawn tennis, so the work that you did with tennis on how the number of reports went up after your training. That is, I mean, that's brilliant. It's I think there has been traditionally a fear of that, and sports have been very reluctant to allow, any kind of research or to gather statistics, because they're afraid. I understand that, and they're afraid that this might affect their reputation, and particularly if they are, one of only a handful of sports that reports these rates. I think that attitude is slowly changing. But I mean, I often say to people that I work with, if they say, our sport we don't have that problem. Only nice people coach and train here, so we don't have that problem.
Well,
I often say that is a problem. I mean,
they don't understand it's the nice people that are the Pied Pipers that are the problem.
The wolf in sheep's clothing, isn't it? Absolutely.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, how that's why I think programs like this will hopefully, there'll be some parents watching this that'll think, actually, I will watch my child play football or anything like that. I will. So would you say there are some sports that shine up higher on the list or not?
Again, I don't think we can say that
right
at present. It's a really difficult one, because often figures are not available. The study that we did with the 10,000 people was across, I can't remember off the top of my head how many sports were referred to in that, but it was across the board. There is no sport that is immune from this issue, that's for sure. I don't think we can say that any particular sport has a particular problem. The stats certainly don't measure that out, and I think there's actually a danger in doing that anyway, because that would then mean that we take our eye off the ball on other sports. This is an issue that affects all sports at all levels.
What about racism? Is that a problem?
I mean, kind of getting slightly out of my area of expertise, but certainly there's other researchers who specialize in that, have identified, a lot of racism occurs in sport. We know in terms of abuse that coming from a minority ethnic background is a risk factor. So, there's various risk factors. Being disabled, having a disability is a risk factor. Being higher up the performance spectrum, so an elite or just below elite level, that comes with an increased risk of experiencing abuse. Being non-heterosexual also is increased risk.
Because
so does being from a minority group.
Oh golly, I should know this, shouldn't I? The guy who there was a brilliant diver. And he married his
Tom Daley.
That's it, Tom Daley. He suffered quite a bit with it, didn't he? I seem to remember. I mean, times have. I don't know why people. I mean, I have absolutely no interest in people's sexuality whatsoever, as long as you're not abusing children or old people. Then go and do what you like, but not, because See, what is interesting with this organisation I got involved with is because of this problem with coaches that are freelance, because in a lot, like in teaching, so freelance musicians, parents don't understand this. They don't need a DBS.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's insane. So what we did with the Lawn Tennis Association, because of this terrible situation with Wrexham Tennis Centre, I said to them, look, they don't need one, but why don't you give an accreditation to the tennis clubs that come under the LTA wing and get the badge of honour? You have to have an enhanced DBS check, whether you by legally need to or not, because if you're clean and squeaky clean, why wouldn't you want to do it anyway to protect yourself? And you see, people just don't understand this. And I still go into schools, Mel, where even teachers still don't understand that they don't need an enhanced DBS. Because if you're on the council listing of a coach, then they would have to be. But I mean, it's a dodgy area, isn't it? And it still is. That hole hasn't been filled in, has it?
I mean, again, it's a really difficult one, because certainly anyone can set themselves up as a coach. Literally anybody. Anyone can set up their own club. You don't have to be affiliated to like a national governing body, a sports federation like FIFA or Swim England. You don't have to be. You could just set yourself up on the local playing field on a Saturday morning as a coach, and Bob's your uncle. It's then the responsibility falls on parents to be asking those questions that we talked about at the start, and thinking seriously, is this somebody I would be happy to leave my child alone with for an hour or two?
I mean, but they come across so charming, like our guy did. You see, that's the bit that's shock. I mean, so
can I say on that?
Sorry,
I was going to say on what you said there about the charming, the wolf in sheep's clothing. This is particularly when we're talking about sexual violence perpetrators. That is their MO, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So
absolutely.
We know
you also get the bullying, don't you? If you tell anyone, you won't be on the team.
Yeah.
And you're living the dream and you're 12 years old. I mean, that is going to silence anybody because you don't realize how that's going to impact your life further down the track, do you?
Absolutely. And remember, we know about sexual grooming. We know from research outside of sport and in sport, how it happens. We know the stages. What we also, I think, now are starting to understand is that sexual abuse perpetrators don't only groom children. They groom often the people around them.
Absolutely right.
They groom the parents.
I was in that position. So we're coming up to the end of this. It's sort of flown by. But where do you see are there any gaps that you see have got to be filled in the regulatory framework?
Yeah, great question. I could talk for a whole hour about this, Marilyn. I certainly think you mentioned earlier mandatory reporting. There are moves afoot now to do something about this, and that absolutely needs to happen, and it needs to happen, and sport needs to be included in that. One of the things that has happened in the past is that sport has been excluded, for example, from abuse of trust legislation. Sports coaches were initially excluded from that, so they were legally allowed to have a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old that they coach.
Right.
That has changed now after much lobbying from various organisations and advocates. That we don't want the same thing to happen if mandatory reporting is brought in. And there are talks now about bringing mandatory reporting in. Sport has to be included in that. We cannot keep treating sport as if it's autonomous and separate. That's the first thing. I think there needs to be certainly a rethink of DBS checking. It's not the only tool. Safer recruitment is about more than just DBS checking, but it is a key part, and we need to think about who is checked in what circumstances. Training. I know people talk a lot about training on safeguarding. It's so important. There is certainly there is more training now available that is sport specific as well. A lot of these behaviours are very specific to the culture of sport, and we need to highlight that. There is training available now. It's not available for everybody. It's often quite poor in quality. A lot of so certainly I've seen courses that are a 2 or 3 hour online course that requires very little engagement, requires very little opportunity to challenge views that may be held. So I think there's the training of athletes themselves, particularly given we know that peer-on-peer abuse is quite prevalent. There needs to be training for athletes, and that includes children, in an age-appropriate, language-appropriate way. About what is appropriate behaviour, what is not, about how they can report, who they can go to. Often, young people don't know because they're not really told it. So training absolutely needs to be of a higher quality. It needs to be based on research, and it needs to be embedded across all for different groups. For training for parents, training for athletes, training for coaches, training for officials needs to be mandatory. I think, and I'm not going to open too big a can of worms here, but I think at the moment sport marks its own homework. Sport is largely self-regulating, and autonomous. I think a sport ombudsman, which has been suggested multiple times, most recently by, I think it was in the White Review of Independent Inquiry into Abuse in Gymnastics. We need to start thinking about actually enacting that, about putting an ombudsman in place that's truly impartial and independent, to standardise the policies and the training requirements, reporting, to enhance accountability frameworks, and improve standards. That is, I think, something that we've put off. Successive governments have kicked that can down the road.
Oh, 100%. If it's I know from when I go on media, I was asked to get up last week at 5 o'clock in the morning to go on a well-known news programme, and at 5:30, and it was to do with the figures of kids living in unsafe places in residential care, right? And it was sort of taken off the programme at 1 minute to 5:30. Now I got up early to be replaced by Robert Jenrick resigning. And then again, anything, honestly, anything to do, you can bet your sweet life if they've got nothing else to report about, let's get something on about child abuse, and something happens like, we run out of Smarties at Tesco's. Oh, sorry, that's going to replace child abuse. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
People just don't. 80% of poor mental health is all down to adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah,
and it breaks my heart. Truly breaks my heart. And I suppose you must see. I mean, like you, I love working with young people. I find them inspiring, and even if they're 21 students, it keeps you young, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. Yeah. And I learn so much from them.
100%. You learn, even if they're 8 years old, they come out with the most extraordinary things. You think, well, I hadn't thought of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the thing. I think people, they need to start opening their mind, thinking outside the box, and doing all sorts of that sort of stuff. So, so what is next then for Professor Melanie Lang?
Oh, what is next? Well, I am in the process of we've just proposed another book. So on the academic side, that's a book on children's rights in sport. So again, I think the future in this area is actually we are shifting more towards a discourse of children's rights and embedding children's rights. And I see that as much more of a positive way of thinking about this issue. Safeguard, like as you said, a lot of people just don't want to think or talk about this topic. It's distasteful. It's something they don't want to, And I think that if this is framed as a rights issue, I think there's much more chance that people are gonna take the bait. They're gonna children's rights. We signed up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child back in 1989. That still has rarely been implemented within sport. And although there is there are on paper a lot of protection measures, there are fewer measures for things like listening to children, involving children in their own lives and in their own sports experience. And that has a knock-on impact on things like safeguarding, because if we're not talking to children, if we're not asking them, if we're not listening to them, they are less likely to disclose.
Honestly, Mel, I do find it laughable when you go to some of the courts and they go, the voice of the child must be heard, if only.
Indeed.
If only. And people really do need to up their game, and stammers and things like that, elected mutes, all down to do with stress and trauma. So it is, I think you're doing great work, Mel. I mean, I think it's great. It's a huge task, but I normally start these shows by saying we're going to kick the elephant out of the room, and I think we have.
I hope so. Yeah. Look, if it raises awareness of
100%.
sport as a locus for violence and abuse, if it does that I think job done. There's only so much we can do in 50 minutes.
And we've still left on hope that we are, parents, step up.
Yeah.
Be by your child. Don't let anyone creep in through the side door and groom your child because you're too busy having a coffee in Tesco.
Yeah. Active engagement. Oh,
I like that.
Absolutely.
Oh, Mel, you've been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much
for having me. It's been lovely.
I think you've put so much stuff out there that is really going to help people. You're a very busy lady, and finally, it's lovely to see you. We sort of like this face-to-face online, and if I can help with any of your stuff up there with my I'd love to come. So thank you so much. Thank you
for having me.
And an absolute pleasure. And this will go out once our wonderful producer has started fiddling around with the assets. So I thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well then, that was absolutely wonderful. I hope you learned from it. I learned a lot from it as well. I think Mel is so, not professory at all. She's just so approachable. She's so, she's so relatable. It's lovely. And it's nice to do something like sport because it is so important for our mental health and physical. Even I walk the dog, but I do miles of that, so that's fine. But next week, next week. Now, this is going to be a really gritty subject. Next week, I have the global. She is all over everywhere. If you put in Professor Jane Monckton Smith, started life as a police officer, got an OBE in 2024, and she is going to be talking about domestic homicide. And it will be riveting. It really is extraordinary. Domestic homicide. So please, keep an eye out for that, and keep an eye out for Unprecedented TV. This is Marilyn Hawes with her show Heart and Soul. This will go out on streamed onto YouTube very soon. So thank you, and see you next week. Bye-bye.